The longhouse was warm that night, but the warmth was heavy and restless, like a hearth fire that knew a storm was coming. Outside, winter's breath pressed hard against the thick timber walls, whistling through the smallest gaps, rattling the carved shutters with each icy gust. The moon was veiled in cloud, and the drifts of snow that blanketed the fjord-side village shone only faintly under the reflection of the stars. Inside, the smell of smoke and roasting meat still clung to the air. Firelight lit the carved dragon posts, their eyes seeming to flicker and glower in the shadows. Along the smoke-darkened beams, shapes shifted and stretched like restless spirits. The great fire pit in the centre of the hall burned low now, its embers glowing like the eyes of a wolf waiting in the dark. At the high seat, beneath the great carved pillar of Odin, sat Jarl Einar Ketilsson. His hands rested on the armrests, each carved in the shape of snarling wolves. Hours earlier, the hall had been alive with shouting, song, and the clashing of drinking horns. The Jarl's men had returned from a successful raid along the Irish coast, bringing back silver cups, bolts of cloth, and a handful of trembling slaves. There had been boasting and mead, stories told so loudly they drowned the howl of the wind outside. Now, the feast was over. Most of the warriors had stumbled to their bedding platforms, drunk on victory and drink alike. A few snored where they had fallen, sprawled like felled oaks on the benches. Only the Jarl remained awake. His eyes were fixed, not on the fire, but on the darkness beyond it. There were matters unsettled rival Jarls to the east, a feud over disputed land, rumours of betrayal whispered by a trusted retainer. In the corner, a serving girl moved quietly, her bare feet padding across the rush-strewn floor as she gathered the remains of the feast. She had the tired, watchful look of one used to moving unseen, careful never to disturb the men whose moods could shift like the winter sea. She did not look up when the side door opened. She did not need to. Some shift in the air told her it had. A figure stepped inside, cloaked in shadow. The door shut with only the faintest click of the latch. No guard stirred. No drunken warrior grunted a challenge. The cloaked man moved like a shadow that had learned to walk. He kept to the edges of the hall, where firelight fell weakest. No clank of mail betrayed him. No glint of steel shone in the fire's glow. Only the soft creak of leather straps and the muffled hiss of his breath as he drew closer. From beneath his cloak, his hand emerged, holding a short, narrow CX, a blade made for work in close quarters. The steel had been blackened, not by chance but by craft, dulled with a mixture that caught no light. Its edge gleamed faintly, the pale glint of a predator's tooth. The serving girl's hands froze over the trenchers she carried. Her eyes flickered once toward the man, then back to the floor. She knew the look of him, knew that if she spoke, she would never speak again, so she bent her head lower and let her hair fall across her face. Jarl Einar sensed it too late. The instinct of a warrior, that sudden tightening of the gut, that prickling at the nape of the neck, came a heartbeat before the strike. The man's hand came around his head like a lover's touch, tilting it back with practiced ease. The other hand swept the blade across his throat, in a motion so swift it was almost tender. A hot rush of blood sprayed the carved wolf armrest and hissed as it struck the cold flagstones. The Jarl's eyes went wide for a moment, a word forming silently on his lips. Then the light began to fade from them. The killer did not hurry. He lowered the Jarl gently to the bench, arranging him so that from a distance he might have been mistaken for a man who had dozed off. From a pouch, the assassin took a folded strip of cloth, wiped the blade clean, and tucked the cloth away again. Then, from inside his cloak, he drew a small carved token, a raven of blackened wood. He set it beneath the Jarl's hand, a message only a few in the north would understand. The serving girl glanced up again. The man's hood concealed all but a pair of eyes, sharp, pale, and utterly without warmth. She dared not speak. She dared not even breathe too loudly. And then he was gone. He slipped through the side door into the night without a sound, leaving no trace that he had ever been there. When the wind rattled the shutters again, it sounded no different than it had 100 times before. By dawn, the hall was filled with the wailing of women and the rumbling fury of men. The warriors demanded answers. They would speak of foreign assassins, of treachery from rival Jarls, of curses laid upon the household. Some would say Einar had been struck down for offending Odin himself. Others would mutter of debts left unpaid to dangerous men in distant ports. But none would name the true hand that had ended the Jarl's life. For in the north, there were Brotherhoods whose work was never spoken of in the open. Their names were not recorded in the skald's songs. their faces never carved upon runestones. They moved in the space between light and dark, between truth and rumour. They were men, and sometimes women, who killed not for the glory of battle, but for the fulfilment of oaths sworn in shadow. They did not charge shield walls. They did not stand in the circle of honour to duel before the thing. They killed alone, with a single stroke, and were gone before the body fell. Some called them the unseen. Others spoke of them as nightwalkers, or raven's kin. In truth, they were bound to one another by oaths older than most Jarl's lines, and their loyalty was absolute. They served kings, chieftains, and sometimes only themselves. Payment was not always in silver. Sometimes it was land, sometimes protection for kin, sometimes merely the satisfaction of fulfilling a blood oath. Their existence was an open secret, known but never spoken aloud. To speak their names was to invite their attention, and no man with sense wished for that. And so they moved, season after season, from the fjords of Norway to the icy rivers of the east, from the narrow streets of Hedeby to the wind-swept isles of the west. In every hall, from the smallest farmstead to the mightiest royal seat, men knew that one night, if the wrong words were spoken or the wrong man angered, the door might open and the shadow might come. This night, in the hall of Jarl Einar Ketilsson, the shadow had come, and the balance of power in the north would never be the same again. To understand the shadow that fell across Jarl Einar's hall, we must step away from the flickering firelight of that night and look out across the whole of the Viking world, a world in which not all warriors fought beneath the sun. When most people today imagine a Viking warrior, they picture a man roaring into battle with axe raised high, a shield wall locking step with his brothers, the air thick with the clash of iron and the cries of the dying. And indeed this was the public face of Norse warfare, bold, brutal, and steeped in the ideal of drengskapra, the warrior's honour. To kill in the open, to meet your enemy face to face, this was the way of the hero, sung in the Skald's sagas, and immortalised in the carvings that still stand on weathered stones. But this was not the only way Vikings made war. Behind the shield wall, behind the feasts and the tales of battlefield glory, there existed another face to Norse conflict, the world of the unseen warriors. These were the men who killed in silence, who could pass through an enemy's defences without a shout or a challenge, who could alter the fate of kingdoms with the slip of a knife in the dark. On the surface, such methods clashed with the Norse warrior code. Stealth killings, poisonings, ambushes, these were often condemned as nither, acts of dishonour, but in practice, the line between dishonour and necessity was far less rigid. When a clan's survival hung in the balance, when an enemy could not be met in open war without risking total destruction, shadowed hands were sometimes called upon. The sagas give us hints. They speak of nightwalkers killers who struck under the cover of darkness, whose identities were known only to a few, and whose actions were justified after the fact as the will of the gods or the demands of vengeance. In Egil's saga, a targeted killing is carried out not in battle, but in the secrecy of a private chamber. In Jarl's saga, assassinations are committed as part of blood feuds, where the logic of vengeance overrode the rules of open combat. We have no surviving written code for these secret killers, no manifestos or oaths preserved on parchment. Their existence had to be pieced together from fragments lines in the sagas, whispered references in later chronicles, and the patterns historians have traced across Viking Age politics. It seems clear, however, that these men, and at times, women often operated as part of tightly bound circles. Some were little more than hired blades. Others were tied to extended kinship groups, acting on behalf of their jarl or chieftain to carry out work too dangerous or politically delicate for the light of day. And some were something more structured, shadow brotherhoods, with their own rules, rituals, and signs. The Viking Age was as much a time of political manoeuvring as it was of battlefield conquest. Jarls and kings vied for dominance over trade routes, farmland, and the loyalty of smaller clans. Sometimes, a war could be avoided or provoked by removing one man. If that man were a key war leader, a wealthy merchant, or a rival claimant to power, his sudden and unexplained death could shift the balance in an entire region. Such killings were rarely confessed to, but their fingerprints are visible in the record. We find sudden suspicious deaths, followed by swift political realignments. We read of powerful men taken by the gods on the eve of war, only for their clan to collapse soon after. We find archaeological evidence of graves containing fine weapons, but no armour suggesting a martial life lived without the shield wall, perhaps in service of work that demanded speed, silence, and precision rather than open battle. The Vikings did not invent the concept of the targeted killing. They learned from those they encountered and from those they feared. To the far north, the Bohemians and Sami peoples practiced forms of warfare that relied on stealth, camouflage, and intimate knowledge of the land. These forest and tundra fighters could stalk a man for days without being seen, kill without a sound, and vanish across frozen ground without leaving tracks. From the east, contact with the Kievan Rus and beyond brought knowledge of steppe assassins and Byzantine spies operatives who could slip into a guarded palace and strike unseen. From the west, they encountered Irish factions skilled in ambush warfare and surprise raids, and the deadly use of assassins in clan feuds. The Norse were nothing if not adaptable. What they saw, they learned. And what they learned, they made their own. In truth, the skills of the assassin were not entirely foreign to Viking culture. The same man who could creep silently through the forest to bring down a stag with a single arrow could use those same skills to stalk a human target. The hunter's patience, the fisherman's ability to wait without movement for the perfect moment. These were qualities that could serve in the taking of a man's life as surely as in the taking of game. Many assassins were likely drawn from among the most skilled hunters and scouts, men who could move faster than others through tangled undergrowth, who could travel for days without leaving a trace, and who understood the way sound and light travel in different conditions. In the hands of such men, a knife became as deadly as any axe in battle. To be slain in battle was to meet the gods in Valhalla, to be cut down in the night, without glory, without chance to strike back. This was a far darker fate. It denied a man the chance to meet his end as a warrior, and so, those who walked in the shadows inspired not only fear of death but fear of dishonour. This is why the Brotherhoods kept their power, even though they rarely numbered many men. Their strength lay not in armies, but in the way a single strike could terrify an entire region. If one Jarl could fall silently in his own hall, who was safe? It is striking how little direct mention is made of such killers in surviving Norse literature. We must remember that most of what we know about the Viking Age comes from sagas written down centuries later, often in Christianized Iceland. The chroniclers who preserved the tales of open battle may have had little interest in recording or little knowledge of the shadowed work of assassins. In this way, the Brotherhoods achieved the greatest victory such a group can hope for. They survived in the cracks of history, never fully named, never fully erased. The man who entered Jarl Einar's hall that night was no lone wanderer acting on impulse. He was part of something older, something woven into the fabric of the Viking world itself, an unseen network of oaths, debts, and shadowed loyalties. To find their origin, we must step into the borderlands of the Viking world, where raiding and trading met the cold patience of the hunter's craft. And it is there in the wild edges of the Norse realm that these brotherhoods were born. The frontier of the Viking world was not marked by carved stones or neat lines on a map. It was a living, shifting thing, an edge where the known met the unknown, where open farmland gave way to the tangled darkness of pine and birch, where fjords narrowed into icy rivers that wound toward lands of silence and snow. It was here, in these liminal places, that the secret brotherhoods were born. The heartlands of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden thrived on the rhythm of coastal life, farming, fishing, trading, and raiding across the sea. But beyond these relatively settled zones lay a harsher reality. The inland forests and far northern reaches were ruled not by jarls and kings, but by the land itself, and by the people who had mastered it long before Norsemen dared to trespass. These were the Bohemians, the Sami, the Finno-Ugric tribes of the northern forests. To the Norse, they were strange, almost supernatural. The sagas speak of them in the same breath as spirits and giants. They moved with the reindeer herds, hunted seals on the ice, and fished rivers so cold they steamed in the dawn air. They were not farmers tied to one place. They belonged to the wilderness, and in that wilderness they were uncatchable. When the first Norse expeditions pushed into these borderlands, they came with the same confidence they carried to foreign coasts, confidence in their weapons, their courage, and the fear they inspired. But in the forests of the north, that confidence began to falter. Viking raiding parties would vanish without a fight. Men spoke of eyes watching from the trees, of sudden death in the night. Bodies were found with precise wounds, throats cut so cleanly they left no time for a cry, arrows that struck through gaps in armour with uncanny accuracy. This was a kind of warfare the Norse were unprepared for. Their shield walls and shipboard charges, meant little in a place where there was no open ground, where every tree could hide an enemy and every frozen river could betray a man's weight. In this environment, it was not strength that mattered most, but silence, not the broad sweep of a battle axe, but the quiet thrust of a knife. Some Norse fell to these hunters and were gone, their names remembered only in the sagas as men, lost in the white forests. But others survived, captured, traded, or simply spared. And among those who returned south were some who had seen, with their own eyes, the deadly skill of the forest people. They had watched hunters glide across deep snow on narrow skis, while their pursuers floundered waist-deep. They had seen men appear out of the mist, kill, and vanish without a sound. The Norse were quick learners. The most adaptable among them began to understand that this was not just hunting, it was war by another name. They took these lessons home, passing them quietly to those willing to listen. They learned to move without leaving tracks, to watch for the faintest shift in a branch that might betray an enemy, to strike only when the moment was perfect. These skills found fertile ground in the turbulent politics of the Viking Age. In the crowded halls of Norway's coastal jarls, in the marketplaces of Hedeby and Birka, in the tense gatherings at the Thing, rivalries often simmered just below the surface. The idea of removing a rival without the cost and chaos of open war was tempting, but it required men who could do such work and live to tell no one about it. It was in these moments that the Brotherhoods began to take shape. At first, they were informal, a handful of men bound by loyalty to a chieftain or a clan, called upon to do the work others could not. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain men were known, quietly, as those who could walk the night. They trained together, hunted together, and shared techniques that were not taught to the general warband. They were kept close, trusted with missions that required not only courage, but absolute discretion. The rituals of induction were never written down, but hints survive in fragments of oral tradition. A young warrior might be tested by being sent alone into the forest to follow a target for days without being seen. Another might have to endure the winter night outside without fire or shelter, learning to blend into the land itself. Blood oaths were sworn over blades, not in the public hall, but in the shadowed corners of longhouses or beneath the cover of trees. In time, these oaths came to mean more than any tie of silver or land. To betray the Brotherhood was to forfeit not only one's life, but one's honour, one's memory. There were whispers that those who broke faith were hunted down and erased so thoroughly that even their names were never spoken again. The tools of these men were different from those of the battlefield. The heavy round shield was useless for climbing a palisade in the dark, the long-hafted axe too clumsy for close, silent work. Instead, they favoured the seeks, a long, single-edged knife that could be drawn quickly and used with precision. Bows were smaller and lighter than the hunting bows of common farmers, designed for quick shots at close range. Spears were narrow and balanced for throwing in tight quarters. But perhaps the most important weapon was knowledge, of terrain, of enemy habits, of the unseen paths that led into and out of a settlement. To move unseen was not just to hide from sight, it was to know where the sight lines were, where the wind would carry sound, where the snow would crunch underfoot, and where it would not. These brotherhoods were not armies, they were threads, woven into the fabric of Viking society, thin but strong, invisible until pulled. They could strike in the heart of a feast, in the stillness of a winter night, or in the confusion of a raid. And when they were done, they were gone, leaving only questions, fear, and the quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, had ordered the deed. Their origins in the borderlands left them with a dual nature. They were Norse in loyalty, but in method they carried the spirit of the hunters who had once stalked them. They had learned from those who could vanish into the snow, and they used that gift in the service of their own. By the late 9th century, these methods were no longer just a northern curiosity. Men trained in the Brotherhood style were appearing in the courts of powerful jarls far to the south. Some travelled east into the service of the Roose princes, others west into the feuding kingdoms of Ireland and Scotland, where their skills were paid for in silver and gold. Yet, even as their influence spread, the Brotherhoods kept their roots in secrecy. They were never spoken of in the Thing. No runestones were carved to honour their deeds. They were the necessary shadow behind the bright fire of the Viking Age, a reminder that in every age, the fate of kings and jarls may rest not in the clash of armies, but in the quiet step of a single man in the dark. In the darkened corners of the Longhouse, in the whispering pines of the borderlands, the assassins' brotherhoods found not only their skills, but their soul. And that soul belonged to Odin, To the Norse, Odin was more than a war god. He was the All-Father, the giver of wisdom, the wanderer in disguise who could appear as an old man on the road or a shadow in the rafters. He was the god of poetry and prophecy, but also of treachery and sudden death. He ruled not only over the mead-soaked feasts of Valhalla, but over the gallows where the condemned swung. If Thor was the hammer crashing down in the open field, Odin was the unseen spear point between a man's ribs in the dark. It was no accident that the Brotherhoods claimed him as their patron. Odin's own myths are filled with stealth, cunning, and the art of deception. He wore cloaks of shifting colours, masked his face, and hid his name. In the sagas, he moves among kings and jarls disguised, speaking in riddles, playing both sides of a war until the outcome suits him. He is the master of the unexpected blow, the quiet word that topples a kingdom. For assassins, this was more than myth, it was a guide. The craft of the unseen blades echoed the craft of Odin himself. They believed that to walk in shadow was to walk in his footsteps, to see the world through the single, all-seeing eye he sacrificed for wisdom. The rites of induction into these brotherhoods often mirrored the god's own trials. In whispers passed from master to initiate, there were tales of nights spent hanging in the forest, bound to a tree, the cold biting the skin while the mind wandered into trance. This was the echo of Odin hanging 9 nights on the world tree, sacrificing himself to win the runes. It was said that only those who endured this trial could truly claim to serve him in silence. Weapons, too, bore his mark. Many of the CX knives carried by these men were engraved not with the bright, showy designs of the warrior's axe, but with small, secret runes bindings, to sharpen the blade's bite or to silence the victim's cry. The spear, Odin's own chosen weapon, appeared in miniature form in some of their assassinations, not for practicality, but for symbolism, a signature left on the body to mark the work as Odin's will. And then there was the raven. To most Norse, the raven was a sign of battle, the bird that feasted on the fallen. But to the Brotherhoods, it was more than that. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, were Odin's own companions, his eyes and ears in the mortal world. The carved raven tokens left at certain killings were not merely warnings, they were offerings, returning the deed to the god who had sanctioned it. The presence of Odin in their work also freed these men from the stain of dishonour. In the eyes of many, killing unseen was neither cowardly, but to the unseen blades it was an act of worship. If Odin himself could travel cloaked, strike suddenly, and vanish into the wind, then to follow that path was to serve the highest calling. They did not see themselves as murderers in the shadows, they saw themselves as chosen instruments. In some parts of the Norse world, especially in the north where Christian influence was slow to reach, the connection between Odin and these killers was openly acknowledged. Old men in fishing villages would mutter that a sudden unexplained death meant the Old One has walked this way. Skalds, careful with their words, might hint in verse that the death of a powerful man had been settled in Odin's name. There were even those among the Brotherhoods who were more than warriors. They were seers and rune workers, men who claimed to channel Odin's foresight in choosing when and how to strike. Before a mission, they might cast lots or inscribe runes on bone to divine whether the god favoured the deed. If the signs were ill, they would wait. Patience was as much a weapon as the knife itself. The sagas tell of Odin walking unseen among men, whispering into the ears of kings, guiding the hand that would change the course of a war. In these tales, he is often a manipulator, steering events toward chaos and death, but always with a deeper purpose, testing warriors, shaping destiny. The Brotherhood saw themselves in that role. They believed their killings were not random, but threads in a greater tapestry woven by the god himself. The connection to Odin also shaped their appearance and demeanour. Many favoured dark cloaks, not only for concealment, but as an echo of the wanderer's garb. Some covered one eye in ritual before a killing, a symbolic sharing in the god's sacrifice. Others carried small pouches of herbs and charms, blends of sage, juniper and yew, burned before a mission to call upon his blessing. It is tempting to see all of this as superstition, but for these men, it was the foundation of their identity. In a world where every death could be explained by the will of the gods, they believed themselves to be the hand that made that will manifest. And in serving Odin, they found both purpose and protection. Even in the later years of the Viking Age, when Christianity's white Christ began to take hold in the courts of kings, Odin's shadow lingered in the work of the Brotherhoods. Officially, these killings became justice or punishment, stripped of pagan meaning. But in the hearts of the killers, the old god still watched from the branches of the ash tree. A raven's cry still echoed over the body, and the knife still glinted with his blessing. And so, through faith and fear, through ritual and skill, the Brotherhoods bound themselves to the All-Father. They were not merely assassins, they were his hidden warriors, his unseen blades. And for as long as Odin's name was spoken in the north, his killers would walk unseen through its shadows. No man entered the Brotherhood by chance. It was not enough to be a skilled hunter, a silent tracker, or a deadly fighter. To walk in the shadow, you had to be bound to its soul, blood, and breath, and once that bond was forged, it could never be broken. The oath was not a public ceremony. There were no feasts, no skalds to recite the names of the initiated. Instead, it took place far from the longhouse, often in the deep woods or upon a lonely headland, where the sea winds carried away every word. Those who would join were led there in silence, their eyes bound so they could not retrace the path. The place itself was a secret, and so was the ritual. The masters of the Brotherhood waited in shadow. Some wore the dark cloaks of the wanderer, others the hides of the wolf or raven totems of their craft. Before the initiate, a small fire burned low, fed with juniper and sage until the smoke curled upward in ghostly coils. At the centre lay a weapon, not a sword or a warrior's axe, but the tool of the assassin, often a sea axe with a blackened blade or a slim throwing spear. The oath was spoken in a voice meant for no one but the gods. The initiate swore to serve the Brotherhood above all other loyalties, even kin. He vowed to keep its secrets from all others, on pain of death. He pledged to act without hesitation when called, to kill without question when the mark was given, and to vanish without pride or boasting. For the work of the unseen was not for glory, it was for necessity. There was always a blood offering. Sometimes it was the blood of the initiate's own palm, drawn across the blade he would carry into his first mission. Sometimes it was the blood of a captive animal, offered to Odin as the first life claimed in the initiate's shadowed service. The blood was caught on a strip of cloth, and bound to the weapon's hilt, a reminder that every strike from then on was tied to the oath. Witnesses were few. Those who stood in attendance were already bound by the same vow. A breach of that vow was unthinkable, for the penalty was not merely death but erasure. Betrayers were hunted relentlessly, their bodies hidden, their names struck from every tongue. It was said that when the Brotherhood erased a man, it was as if he had never drawn breath. Once sworn, the initiate's life was no longer entirely his own. He belonged to the Brotherhood, and through it, to Odin. The work would come without warning, a whisper from a shadow in the hall, a carved raven left on his bed, a single rune scratched into the wood of his door. And when the call came, he would obey without hesitation. This absolute obedience was not born from fear alone. The Brotherhood gave much to those it claimed. It provided protection. In a world where alliances could shift overnight, it offered silver, land, and influence that would have been out of reach for most men without noble birth. Most of all, it offered belonging, an unbreakable bond of trust between men who would risk everything for one another in the darkness. The oath also marked a man in ways that could never be erased. Those who served long enough began to carry themselves differently. They moved with the patience of hunters, speaking only when needed, watching everything without appearing to. Their eyes seemed to measure not just men, but the spaces between them, the paths in and out of every room. Even without knowing why, others often stepped aside when such a man passed. There were whispers of deeper oaths, taken only by the most trusted, those who served not merely as killers, but as keepers of the Brotherhood's greatest secrets. These men were entrusted with the names of all its members, with the hidden places where weapons and wealth were stored, with the rituals that bound the Brotherhood to its god. Their loyalty was tested with trials of endurance and skill so severe that few returned unchanged. Some initiates were chosen in youth, long before they had seen true battle. A boy might be plucked from obscurity because his skill at stalking game impressed a passing master, or because his father had once served and paid his debt by giving his son to the cause. Others came to the Brotherhood as seasoned warriors whose value lay in their experience and cunning. In either case, the oath remade them. Once the oath was taken, there was no return to the life before. Even if a man retired from active service, he remained bound to silence until his last breath. Many carried their secrets to the grave without ever revealing the work they had done or the lives they had taken. It was this oath, unbroken across generations, that allowed the Brotherhoods to survive. Armies could be crushed, kingdoms could fall, but an unspoken vow carried in the hearts of men could outlast them all. And in the Viking Age, a time of shifting loyalties and sudden deaths. That vow gave the unseen blades their greatest weapon, the certainty that no one who walked in their shadow could ever truly escape it. Once the oath was sworn, a man did not simply walk into the night and call himself an assassin. The Brotherhood forged its members in secret places, far from the eyes of Jarls and their warriors, in landscapes as dangerous as any enemy. Here, under the watchful gaze of those who had already survived the path, the initiates were broken down and remade. The training grounds were never the same from one Brotherhood to another. Some lay deep in the pine forests, where the wind carried the howl of wolves and the snow never fully melted. Others were hidden in the high valleys where the mountains closed in and the sun touched the earth for only a few hours each day. Some were little more than lonely stretches of coastline, where the roar of the sea drowned all other sounds. The only constant was isolation. No one who was not bound by the oath could know where these places were. Here, the first lesson was silence, not the simple quiet of holding one's tongue, but the deeper stillness of a hunter who becomes part of the land itself. An initiate would be made to track a master without being seen or heard for hours, sometimes days. If he failed, he began again. If he succeeded, the trial grew harder. The masters would vanish into the forest, or slip away into the rocks along the coast, forcing the initiate to learn how to read the smallest clues: a bent blade of grass, a single grain of sand disturbed, a breath of wind that carried the faintest scent of man. The second lesson was patience. In the Brotherhood, a killing could take minutes or it could take months. An initiate might be ordered to follow a mock target for days without ever revealing himself, to watch and wait for the moment when the strike would matter most. Many failed this lesson. Those who could not hold back the urge to act too soon were not trusted with the Brotherhood's work. Physical training was relentless, but unlike the drills of a warrior in the shield wall, there was no clashing of weapons, no open duels. Instead, the training focused on speed, precision, and control. Knives were thrown at small moving targets, until the hand could send the blade exactly where it needed to go in the space of a heartbeat. Bows were drawn and loosed in silence, the string never allowed to snap loudly, the arrow always sent where it would do the most harm, with the least warning. Climbing was a skill as vital as fighting. The Brotherhood taught its initiates to scale the high walls of palisades without a ladder, to pull themselves silently onto rooftops, to move across the beams of a longhouse without making the timbers creak. Rope and grappling hooks were used, but the best could climb with nothing but their hands and feet, finding holds in the smallest cracks. Every assassin learned to move as though he carried nothing, even when burdened with weapons. This was the art of balance and footwork. A man who stumbled in the dark or made the snow crunch underfoot could lose his life before reaching the mark. The training involved crossing frozen streams on fallen branches, moving over rock faces slick with sea spray, and navigating reed-filled marshes where a single misstep could leave a man trapped in sucking mud. The harshest lesson was endurance. An initiate might be sent into the wild with only a knife and told to return in a week. He would have to find food, shelter, and warmth without giving away his position. Some came back leaner and harder, their eyes sharper than before. Others never returned at all. The Brotherhood accepted these losses without sentiment. If a man could not survive the land, he would not survive the work. There was also the training of the mind. A killer's weapon was not only his blade, but his judgment. Masters drilled their initiates in reading the habits of men, how to know when a guard would grow tired, and when a man's thoughts would wander, when a household was most vulnerable, and when a mark would be alone. They learned to see the patterns in human life as clearly as a hunter sees the tracks of deer in snow. Deception was its own discipline. The Brotherhood taught its members how to blend into any setting, to pass as a harmless beggar, a wandering trader, or a servant too insignificant to notice. They learned to carry their weapons in ways that drew no eye, to hide them in plain sight as farm tools or carving knives. Some even practiced the art of mimicry, copying the voices and gestures of others to gain passage into guarded places. There were moments when the training crossed into ritual. Before a final trial, a master might blindfold an initiate and lead him into the forest at night. There he would be told a single name, the name of his first mark. He would have to find that man, learn his patterns, and strike at the time and place of his choosing. Success meant acceptance into the Brotherhood as a full blade. Failure meant exile or worse. It was said that the greatest of the Brotherhood's masters could take an unskilled youth and, within a year, turn him into a shadow that could pass unseen through a crowded hall. But those who emerged from the training grounds were more than skilled, they were altered. Their movements became quieter, their speech more measured. Their eyes rarely rested, and their ears seemed to catch every sound. They no longer belonged entirely to the world of ordinary men. When an initiate left the training grounds for the last time, he did so as a different man. He carried not just the weapons of the Brotherhood, but its discipline and its silence. From that day forward, every step, every glance, every breath could be part of the work, and when the Brotherhood called, he would be ready. To fight in the shadows, the assassin could not rely on the clamour of sword and shield. His weapons were not for the battlefield, but for the stillness between heartbeats, for the moment when breath hung in the cold air, and a man had no idea death was already upon him. These tools were crafted not for glory, but for precision, silence and speed. The most iconic of these was the CX. Short, curved slightly forward, and sharpened to a fine edge. The CX was a knife born not of ceremony, but of necessity. Warriors across the Viking world carried CXs at their belts, but the Brotherhood's blades were different. Their edges were blackened with ash, their hilts wrapped in dull leather to avoid glint in the moonlight. Some bore runes for silence or for swiftness, carved by those who still believed the gods listened in the moment of the kill. The CX was not a tool for wild flailing. It was meant to slip between ribs, to part the throat in a single motion, to sever the tendon behind the knee of a fleeing target. Those who trained with it learned to strike in silence, to use the curve of the blade to hook, pull, and cut in the same motion. With enough skill, a man could drop another to the earth without spilling a sound louder than a breath. Where the CX failed at range, the bow took its place. But the Brotherhood's bows were not the tall, broad-limbed weapons of battlefield archers. These were short, compact, and designed for use in tight spaces in alleyways, on rooftops, or from behind tree trunks. The draw was light, the arrows short, and fletched with dark feathers to vanish in flight. Arrowheads were shaped for penetration, narrow and barbed, designed to punch through cloth and flesh and lodge deep. In the hands of a trained assassin, the bow became more than a weapon. It became a voice that spoke from 100 paces away, ending a conversation before it began. One arrow, one death, no questions. Another favoured weapon was the throwing axe, though not the heavy ones used in raiding. The Brotherhood crafted smaller versions balanced for flight, with sharpened edges and short hafts. These were not meant to cleave through shields, but to sink into the skull of a lookout or sever a spine at the base of the neck. Assassins practiced for hours, each day, hurling their axes at wooden dummies and posts until the blade struck true without effort. Some Brotherhoods trained in the use of the garrote, a tool of strangulation made from twisted sinew or horsehair. It was a weapon of utter finality, silent, brutal, and irreversible. Used in confined spaces, in beds or chambers where steel would flash too brightly, it left no blood, no blade to trace, only the wide-eyed silence of the dead. More rarely they used tools that could double as common objects. A fisherman's gutting knife, a woodworker's awl, a carving chisel wrapped in linen. These were weapons hidden in plain sight, passed through enemy checkpoints, or carried into towns where open weapons would raise alarms. The Brotherhood prized adaptability. If the killing blow could be struck with an eating knife or a loose roof tile, then so be it. Poison was used, but sparingly. The Norse viewed poison with suspicion, often considering it the tool of cowards or sorcerers. Yet in some Brotherhoods, particularly those influenced by Slavic or Eastern traditions, it became part of the arsenal. Powders were derived from hemlock, wolfsbane, and certain mushrooms. Oils were rubbed onto blades or mixed into wine. A skilled assassin could carry death in a ring or in the dust on his fingertips. But this was dangerous work, both for the target and for the killer. One mistake, and the Brotherhood lost a valuable blade to his own craft. The tools of disguise were as vital as the weapons themselves. A cloak of the right length and colour could obscure weapons from watchful eyes. Boots were fitted with soft soles to muffle steps. Some carried hollowed rings with locking compartments, tiny things that held poison, fire starters, or bits of flint. The Brotherhood's ingenuity in this regard bordered on the uncanny. More than the physical tools, though, it was how they were used that made them deadly. A battlefield warrior depended on strength and endurance. The assassin depended on timing, anatomy, and the mind of his victim. He had to know not only where to strike, but when. Was the guard about to turn? Would the mark lean forward at this hour to drink from a horn? Would the sound of the wind cover the approach? This required not just martial skill, but but deep observation. Assassins studied the habits of their targets, like a hunter studies the deer trail, where the target sat, when they were alone, which doors they used, whether they carried armor at night or let it fall beside the bed. Every action was a map to vulnerability. And still, for all their tools, the greatest weapon of the Brotherhood was discipline. Any man could swing a blade. But not every man could wait 3 days in a snowdrift, unmoving, just to deliver one fatal strike and then vanish again. Not every man could kill with no song, no silver, no name sung around the fire. The Brotherhood did not reward its killers with fame. It rewarded them with purpose. To carry these weapons was to carry the weight of silence. Not just silence of sound, but silence of spirit, the discipline to disappear, to blend into the landscape, to become less than a shadow until the moment of action. And when the killing was done, to leave behind not a banner, not a body count, but a whisper, a name suddenly never spoken again, a seat at the table left permanently empty. This was the signature of the unseen blades, not the weapon itself, but the absence it left behind. An assassin's skill with a blade meant nothing if he was seen before the strike. In the Brotherhood, invisibility was not a trick of shadows. It was a discipline of the body, the mind, and the spirit. The masters taught that the most dangerous man was not the one you saw and feared, but the one you did not notice until the blade was already at your throat. Camouflage was the first art. In the forests of the north, assassins wore cloaks sewn from wolf or reindeer hide, the fur dulled and worn, so it matched the snow-mottled trees. In winter, they wrapped themselves in pale furs dusted with ash to blend into the frozen world. In the warmer months, they stitched garments from rough spun wool, dyed with the browns and greens of the forest floor, rubbed with soil and crushed pine to dull the colour. These were not costumes, they were second skins, garments that erased the line between man and landscape. Movement was as important as appearance. A poorly timed step could undo the best disguise. Trainees learned to move with the rhythm of wind in branches, to freeze when birds took flight, to let the sound of distant surf or the creak of a swaying mast mask their footfalls. In snow, they moved heel to toe to lessen the crunch, placing each step where the master before them had stepped to leave no extra trail. In settlements, disguise became a different craft. Here, the assassin could not hide in trees or rocks, he had to hide in plain sight. The Brotherhood trained its members to pass as merchants, fishermen, beggars or wandering skalds. They carried tools of the trade appropriate to their guise: nets for a fisherman, a harp for a skald, a basket of goods for a trader. Weapons were hidden in plain objects, daggers inside walking sticks, throwing knives beneath loaves of bread, garrotes wound inside belts of woven leather. Facial disguise was rare in the Viking Age, but the Brotherhood understood the power of altering a man's presence. A bent back, a limp, a stooped posture could make a tall, strong man seem frail and unthreatening. Dirt rubbed into the skin, soot in the hair, or a simple cloth cap could make him look like any other traveller. The art was not to create a new face, but to become unremarkable. They also practiced the art of mingling. In a market square, an assassin might join a cluster of gossiping traders, laughing at their tales while keeping one eye fixed on the mark. In a feast hall, he might drink beside strangers, feigning interest in their boasting while noting every time the target left his seat. The mark might even speak to him, shake his hand, offer him a horn of mead, never realising that he had already invited death into his circle. The Brotherhood also trained in environmental disguise, turning the terrain itself into a hiding place. In coastal raids, they hid among fishing nets on shore, or in the dark hulls of overturned boats. In the highlands, they became part of the rock, crouched motionless in the shadow of a boulder. In forests, they wrapped themselves in branches and moss, becoming indistinguishable from the undergrowth until the moment of the strike. One of the most feared techniques was the vanishing. After a kill, the assassin would discard his disguise and become someone entirely different within moments. A fisherman stepping off a boat with a net might slip into an alley and emerge minutes later as a cloaked merchant. The ability to shift identity instantly was a lifeline without it. Even the most perfect killing could lead to capture. Some Brotherhoods even took to wearing the garb of their enemies. A man might don the tunic of a rival clan's guard, walk through their gates, and complete his work before the first suspicion arose. This was dangerous, for capture meant not only death, but a death steeped in shame. Yet the most daring blades took this risk willingly, for the disguise offered a chance to walk unchallenged into the heart of an enemy stronghold. In the cities of the East, in Novgorod and Kiev, assassins adopted foreign clothing to pass as Rus traders or Byzantine merchants. In the Western Isles, they dressed as Gaelic fishermen, their speech peppered with local words learned from trade voyages. A good disguise could mean not just survival, it could mean the difference between slipping away unseen and starting a war. But in all disguises, one rule was absolute: never draw attention twice. If a man played the part of a fisherman one day, he could not return in the same guise the next. Familiarity bred memory, and memory was death to the assassin. Camouflage and disguise were not just tools, they were weapons in their own right. A man who could disappear into the crowd could walk past the sharpest-eyed guard, could stand at the shoulder of a king, could lean over a sleeping enemy without a whisper of alarm. The Brotherhood's blades were sharp, but their disguises? They were sharper still. Infiltration was an art, as refined as any in the Brotherhood's arsenal. To strike at the heart of an enemy's hall or camp, an assassin first had to become a ghost, passing unseen through barriers of wood, stone, and vigilance. The masters taught that getting in was only half the work. To survive, you had to get out again without leaving so much as the echo of your passing. Every settlement and stronghold had its weaknesses. The Brotherhood trained its initiates to find them, to walk the perimeter as a casual visitor, to note where walls leaned, where guards grew bored, where a gate sagged on its hinges. They studied the rhythm of sentries, their patrol routes, the points where their paths overlapped and left brief gaps of solitude. Scaling was one of the most basic but vital skills. Palisades were climbed with hooked knives or small wooden pegs jammed between logs. Rope was used sparingly, for it could be seen from afar. A skilled assassin could ascend a wall with nothing more than the tips of his fingers and the leather of his boots, pressing into cracks and joints as naturally as a squirrel climbs a tree. Doors were rarely taken head-on. Instead, the Brotherhood favoured the lesser-used entries, servants' doors, postern gates, or the low crawl holes used for dragging firewood inside. Some strongholds had hidden sally ports meant for surprise raids. The assassin turned these into his own paths of entry, and if no entry existed, he made one prying loose a log from a palisade, widening a chink in the wall until a man could slip through sideways. Waterways were another favoured route. Many Viking halls stood near rivers or along the coast, and these offered their own hidden doors. An assassin might swim silently beneath a pier, climb a ship's mooring ropes, or follow a drainage channel into the bowels of a settlement. In the dead of night, the splash of water was masked by the lap of waves, the soft churn of the tide. Inside, the work shifted from stealth of approach to stealth of movement. Longhouses were filled with creaking boards and sleeping men. The assassin learned to step only where the floor was solid, to skirt the edges of rugs, to lean his weight into posts and beams that would not betray him with sound. His hands were as vital as his feet, used to steady against walls, to brace in doorways, to catch himself if his balance faltered. The escape was planned before the strike was made. A killing meant nothing if the killer was caught in the act. Some Brotherhoods taught their blades to create diversions, a knocked-over pot in another room, a thrown stone against the far wall, to draw attention away from the true path of retreat. Others relied on sheer speed, moving through the stronghold so quickly that by the time shouts rose, they were already gone. In cities or large settlements, escape often meant blending with the crowd. An assassin might strip off a cloak, tuck away his weapon, and emerge from an alley as a harmless labourer or drunk. In more dangerous situations, he could vanish into the market stalls, duck into a tavern, or even join a procession of priests or traders moving through the streets. When the escape route was compromised, the Brotherhood taught the art of the fallback. These were hidden caches of tools and disguises, left in safe spots outside the target area, a rolled cloak, and fisherman's net hidden under a pier, a bundle of clothing buried beneath a bush, a small skiff tethered in reeds. These allowed the killer to shed his old skin and emerge as someone new before pursuit could close in. In the wilderness, escape relied on the land itself. An assassin could vanish into the folds of a hillside, cross a stream to throw off dogs, or double back through dense undergrowth to confuse trackers. Those trained in the far north used snowshoes to move swiftly over deep drifts, leaving tracks that seemed to disappear when they crossed bare rock. There were legends of assassins who could vanish even when surrounded. One tale speaks of a blade who struck a Jarl in the centre of his feast, then disappeared into the smoke of the hearth fire. Another tells of a killer cornered in an alley, who simply stepped into the shadow of a doorway and was gone. These were the feats the Brotherhood celebrated not for the magic they seemed to hold, but for the discipline and planning that made them possible. For the unseen blades, mastery of entry and escape was more than skill, it was survival. The strike itself could last a heartbeat, but the preparation and retreat could take days. A true assassin left nothing behind but the silence he carried with him, and the memory of a door left slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The Brotherhood's blades were not used only for revenge or personal blood feuds. In the hands of a cunning Jarl, they became tools of politics, silent levers that could shift the balance of power without the cost and chaos of open war. One killing, done in the right place at the right time, could achieve what years of raiding and siege might never accomplish. Viking politics were a web of shifting loyalties. Jarls vied for dominance over trade routes, fertile lands, and the loyalty of powerful families. Alliances were forged at feasts and broken before the mead horns had cooled. The Thing, the great assembly of free men, could settle disputes in law, but law was only as strong as the men willing to enforce it. And when the law could not give a man what he wanted, the Brotherhood could. An assassin could remove a rival claimant before he gathered enough support to challenge for the chieftain's seat. He could silence a troublesome voice in the Thing, an elder whose opinion carried too much weight in the hall. He could end a blood feud by cutting down the most dangerous warrior on the other side, leaving the rest leaderless and disorganized. The killings were rarely acknowledged as political acts. In the sagas, they appear as accidents, divine judgments, or sudden illness. A man might be said to have been taken by the gods on the eve of a crucial vote, or to have fallen in his sleep the night before a fleet set sail. The truth that he had been chosen by the Brotherhood's unseen council was spoken only in whispers, if at all. These political killings often carried signatures understood only by the powerful. A dagger left in a Jarl's chair could mean a warning rather than an execution, a reminder that he had been spared but could be taken at any time. A raven token placed at a chieftain's door might mean his enemies had marked him, giving him one last chance to yield without bloodshed. The Brotherhood was careful in choosing sides. Their loyalty could be bought with silver, but the wisest Jarls knew it was not simply a matter of coin. A killer bound to one lord today might be bound to his enemy tomorrow if the oath was stronger, and so alliances with the Brotherhood were often cemented with gifts, protection for their families, or promises of land far from the reach of vengeance. Some Jarls kept their own quiet men on retainer, using them not just for assassination but for intimidation. A whisper that such a man had been seen in the marketplace could be enough to halt a rebellion before it began. The Brotherhood understood this power well, and often let the threat of their presence work more effectively than the killing itself. In times of war, political killings could cripple an enemy before the first blade was drawn in open battle. By removing captains, shipwrights, or supply masters, the Brotherhood could delay or even cancel a campaign without ever facing the enemy in the field. The killing of a fleet's master navigator could strand an entire army in foreign waters, turning victory into disaster. There were moments when the Brotherhood acted not for hire but for its own political aims. When a ruler grew too powerful, threatening to bring all of the North under a single banner, some say the Brotherhood struck to restore balance. To them, chaos and division were not weakness but opportunity. A divided land meant more lords, seeking their services, more hands willing to pay for the silence of the blade. Such acts fed the Brotherhood's legend. Lords feared them, but they also needed them. To be in the Brotherhood's favour was to have an invisible shield. To be against them was to feel a knife at one's back, even in the safety of one's own hall. In the politics of the Viking Age, every sword in the open field mattered, but one unseen blade could decide the fate of kingdoms. The sagas that have come down to us from the Viking Age are filled with roaring shield walls, bloody duels, and oaths sworn before the gods. Yet between the verses of open battle and honour-bound vengeance, there are moments small, almost hidden, where shadows move in silence. These are the ghost passages, the whispers of killings that do not fit the heroic mould. They are the footprints of the Brotherhood in the literature of the North. In Egil's saga, Skallagrimsonar, the great warrior poet Egil avenges his brother's death, not on the battlefield but by striking down Atli the Short in a sudden, unannounced attack. It is told as personal vengeance, yet the way Egil moves the calculated approach, the swift and final strike, has the mark of a man schooled in silent killing. In Njál's saga, there are darker hints. We read of houses set aflame in the dead of night, of men slain as they slept, of targeted killings that remove key figures from feuds, just when their side seems strongest. The killers are often unnamed, described only as men unknown or night walkers. Such phrases carry a peculiar weight, as though the skalds themselves knew but would not speak the truth aloud. The Laxdæla saga contains a scene where a man is found dead, his body carefully arranged as if he had lain down to rest. No wound is described, no battle fought. The killer is never named, but those who hear the tale nod knowingly. In a society that prized open combat, such silences in the record speak volumes. And then there are the supernatural echoes. In the Grettis saga, Grettir encounters what is said to be a draugr, an undead warrior, that comes in the night to kill without warning. But if we strip away the ghost story, what remains is the pattern of a stealth attack, approach unseen, strike in darkness, vanish without trace. It is easy to imagine that some monsters of the sagas were, in truth, living men whose craft was too terrifying to describe plainly. The phrase nithvarg, or wolf in disgrace, appears in certain tales to describe those who kill without warning. Wolves in Norse poetry are often metaphors for outlaws, raiders, and killers, yet the wolf is also the hunter, the one who stalks and waits. When a saga speaks of a man as a wolf in human form, it may be recalling more than just his ferocity. It may be marking him as one who walks the Brotherhood's path. Some of the oldest poems in the Poetic Edda carry imagery that resonates with the work of the unseen blade. In Grimnismal, Odin himself moves among men in disguise, seeing without being seen, speaking riddles that carry hidden threats. In Havamal, the All-Father warns that the fool thinks all who smile are friends, a truth any assassin would understand. The skalds, bound by their role as historians and storytellers, could not always speak openly of such killings. To name an assassin was to invite the Brotherhood's attention, and no poet wished his own verse to become his death song. So they wove the deeds into allegory, into hints and shadows, into the mouths of gods and ghosts. It is in these shadows that we glimpse the true reach of the Brotherhood. They were not simply blades for hire, they had become part of the North's cultural memory, their methods so familiar that they could be cloaked in myth without losing their meaning. Even when the literal truth was hidden, the idea remained. There were men in the Viking Age who could kill without warning, without honour, and without leaving a trace. These ghost passages remind us that the Viking Age was never as simple as the sagas make it seem. Behind the clash of armies and the boasting in the mead hall, there moved another force silent, patient, and deadly. And while the heroes fought in the open, the ghosts of the Brotherhood shaped the fate of the North in ways few dared to speak of. Not every blade drawn in the Brotherhood's service was for silver or the ambitions of a Jarl. Some killings were older, deeper, and bound by ties stronger than coin. In the North, where the line between family honour and personal survival was as fine as the edge of a sea axe, there were deaths carried out for blood killings, in which the assassin became the instrument of clan vengeance. In the Viking world, family was the foundation of everything. A man's name, his inheritance, his place in the thing, his right to speak and be heard, these were all anchored in the strength and reputation of his kin. But with that came an unbreakable code. If a kinsman was wronged, the wrong must be answered. To leave an insult unavenged was to let it fester, poisoning the name for generations. The sagas are filled with feuds born from such wrongs. Sometimes the spark was greater killing in a drunken brawl, a stolen wife, a field seized by force. Sometimes it was small, a mocking word at a feast, a slap given in jest but taken as insult. Whatever the cause, once the feud was lit, it burned until the debt was paid in blood, or until both sides were ruined. The honourable path was open vengeance, a challenge issued before witnesses, a duel fought under the gaze of the thing, a raid launched against the offending household. But honour and survival did not always walk the same road. When the rival clan was too strong to face in the open, or when the political cost of open vengeance was too high, families sometimes turned to the shadows, to the Brotherhood. Such contracts were not always spoken aloud. Words could be dangerous, and the fewer spoken, the safer for all. A grieving son might send a trusted go-between to the meeting places known only to those who dealt in shadows. He would carry no letter, no token save perhaps a small, carved raven or the broken hilt of a family blade. A name might be whispered, a place described, and that would be enough. Payment came in many forms. The most common was silver coin or ingots melted from arm rings and treasures. Sometimes land was promised, a strip of field or a plot by the shore. In times of scarcity, payment might be made in food. barrels of salted fish, sacks of grain, sides of smoked meat. But there were also killings done without payment at all. If the cause was deemed righteous in the eyes of the Brotherhood, if the wrong was deep, and the insult stank to the gods themselves, the blades might take up the cause for nothing, but the satisfaction of seeing justice done. The work itself was as careful and deliberate as any political killing. The assassin learned the habits of the mark, the path he took to the fields each morning, the nights he stayed late at the alehouse, the times he walked alone to the riverbank. He studied the shape of the household, the places where a man might be alone, the routes that would let him vanish after the strike. Sometimes the killing came in the quiet before dawn, when the mark stumbled half awake to the privy and never returned. Sometimes it came at the edge of the crowd during a feast, a sudden blade slipping between ribs as the hall roared with laughter. And sometimes it came in the open air, on a road between villages, where the wind carried away the sound before it could reach another ear. These killings could be clean and silent, but they were not always meant to be hidden. In the world of clan feuds, the message was often as important as the act. A body might be left where all could see it, the wound chosen for its meaning, a slit throat for betrayal, a broken neck for a usurper, a mark carved into the flesh to remind all who saw it of the wrong that had been avenged. Such signs were not for strangers, they were for the clan, a signal that the debt had been paid and the honour of the family restored. They were also a warning to any who might think to test that family's strength again. The impact of these killings rippled far beyond the moment of the strike. Without their strongest warrior or most cunning leader, a rival clan could lose the will to continue the feud. The loss could throw them into disarray, their allies questioning whether to stand beside them. In other cases, the killing was the blow that forced both sides to the thing, to settle terms, the bloodshed too costly to continue. But killing for the clan carried dangers for the Brotherhood as well. If the blade's hand was revealed, it could draw vengeance from the victim's kin, and unlike a jarl's political target, a grieving family could be relentless. Worse still was betrayal. If the family who had sought the Brotherhood's help spoke too freely of the deed, or if they refused to honour their side of the bargain, they might find themselves the next to feel the cold kiss of the CX. The Brotherhood's loyalty was deep, but their retribution was deeper. In the sagas, there are stories of friends in the night who appeared to aid a man in his darkest hour. These friends asked for nothing in the moment, but left the man with the knowledge that he now carried a debt. That debt might be called years later, when the Brotherhood needed a ship, a hiding place, or even a killing of their own. For the assassins, killing for the clan was more than work. It was a reaffirmation of their place in the web of kinship and obligation that bound the Viking world together. Even those who lived in the shadows understood the importance of blood ties. By taking up a family's cause, they tied themselves to that family's fate, becoming part of the clan's story as surely as any warrior who had fought for them in the open. Sometimes the ties ran both ways. There were Brotherhood members who would take no coin for work done on behalf of their own kin, who saw the killing not as a service, but as a duty. In such cases, the assassin was not only a weapon of the Brotherhood, but a living extension of the clan's honour. His blade spoke not just for himself or his hidden order, but for generations of blood behind him. And so, in the long tangle of feuds and alliances that marked the Viking Age, the Brotherhood's blades moved as both shadow and kin. They were the unseen hand that struck when open war was impossible, the quiet voice that spoke when louder voices would bring ruin. In the end, killing for the clan was the Brotherhood's oldest work, older than the political murders of jarls and kings, older even than their service to Odin. It was the work of kinship, the primal law that no insult could go unanswered, no blood spilled without an answering drop. In a world where every wrong demanded payment, the Brotherhood ensured that the account was always balanced, paid in silver, paid in flesh, or paid in the silence that follows a life suddenly ended. The Brotherhoods of the Viking Age were born in the shadows of the north, shaped by the needs of clan and chieftain, but the Vikings were never a people to remain within the borders of their own lands. They sailed the seas, rode the rivers, and walked the roads of the known world, and wherever they went, they learned. The craft of the assassin, like the craft of the seafarer, was enriched by the skills and secrets they brought home from afar. The first and perhaps most important influence came from the far north itself. Long before the Vikings learned the ways of southern kingdoms, they crossed paths with the Sami and the mysterious Bohemians. These were people of the forests, mountains, and tundra, masters of moving unseen across the snow, hunters who could vanish into the land as though they had never been there at all. The Vikings first feared them, then respected them, and finally learned from them. They studied how the Sami used the wind to carry away their scent, how they could travel miles without leaving a track, and how they lay in wait for days without betraying their presence. These lessons became part of the Brotherhood's foundation. The cold patience of the hunter turned to human prey. From the east came another current of influence. The Vikings who traded and raided along the rivers of the Rus encountered the steppe peoples, the Pechenegs, Khazars, and others whose warriors were as skilled in deception as they were in mounted combat. These men were scouts, spies, and killers, used to infiltrating enemy camps under cover of night. They wore soft leather boots that whispered over the grass, and they carried recurved bows small enough to hide beneath cloaks, yet powerful enough to kill at close range. Viking blades returning from these voyages sometimes brought with them new techniques of silent approach, the use of smaller, lighter bows for assassinations, and the habit of keeping weapons concealed until the very moment of the strike. Further down the rivers, Viking traders reached Constantinople, the city they called Miklagartha. There they served in the Varangian Guard, the personal protectors of the Byzantine emperors. Within those palace walls, they witnessed the intrigues of one of the most sophisticated courts in the world. Here, assassination was not a thing of shame, but a tool of politics as refined as diplomacy or war. Byzantine agents moved through the city in layers of disguise, their work sanctioned by imperial authority. They killed with subtle poisons, arranged accidents that left no visible wound, and removed rivals without ever raising a sword. The Norse who served there brought home these lessons, and some brought back more tangible things, rare poisons, clever tools for breaking locks, and the knowledge of how to hide a killing within a feast. To the west, in Ireland and Scotland, the Vikings encountered another tradition of stealth killing. Among the Gaelic clans, blood feuds were as fierce as in the north, but the land was different: dense forests, misted hills, and rocky shores that offered hiding places to those who knew them well. The Gaels were masters of ambush. They could melt into the bogs or forests and strike a passing enemy without warning, vanishing again into the green. The Vikings learned to adapt their own methods to such terrain, incorporating ambush tactics into the Brotherhood's repertoire. They also learned the value of local disguise, wearing the plaid of the Gaels, adopting their weapons and even their speech to pass unnoticed among them. Across the narrow sea in England, the Danelaw settlements gave the Vikings prolonged contact with the Anglo-Saxons. Here they found another form of quiet killing: political murders carried out by household retainers, trusted servants, or even members of a lord's personal guard. In the courts of Mercia and Wessex, a blade could be more dangerous at the king's table than on the battlefield. The Vikings observed the way such killings were arranged, how a cupbearer might be bribed, how a hunting accident could be made to serve as execution, how a guard might forget his duty at just the right moment. These subtler forms of court intrigue found their way into the northern halls, shaping how the Brotherhood operated within the feasts and assemblies of the Norse elite. Not all lessons came from human teachers. On their voyages to the Mediterranean, the Vikings encountered fortifications, unlike any in the north: high stone walls, guarded gates, and narrow killing streets designed to trap attackers. Breaking into such places demanded new skills: climbing with grappling hooks, using the shadows cast by towers to approach unseen, finding unguarded postern gates or old drainage tunnels. These techniques became part of the Brotherhood's tradecraft, allowing them to infiltrate even the most secure keeps of the north. The influence of the wider world also changed the weapons the Brotherhood carried. From the east came slimmer, sharper daggers of eastern steel, their points designed to pierce armor gaps. From the south came the concept of the stiletto, a thrusting blade that left a wound so narrow it could be hidden beneath the victim's clothing. Even the throwing axe, a staple of Norse warfare, evolved under foreign influence, with lighter, better balanced heads borrowed from Frankish smiths. Perhaps the most important lesson the Brotherhood learned abroad was not of weapons or disguises, but of patience. In the courts of Byzantium, in the long feuds of the Gaelic clans, and in the political intrigues of Anglo-Saxon halls, assassinations were often delayed for months, even years, until the perfect moment came. The Norse, used to the swift decision of the raid and the duel, learned that in the shadows, time itself was a weapon. To wait until an enemy was isolated, weakened, or distracted was to ensure the strike would be final. The Brotherhood adapted each lesson to their own needs. They did not simply copy the tactics of others, they reshaped them for the fjords, forests, and long winters of the north. A Byzantine poison might be replaced by a local brew of hemlock and foxglove. A Gaelic ambush might be reimagined for the frozen paths of Norway. An Anglo-Saxon court trick might be adapted for a thing assembly or a feast in a longhouse. In this way, the Brotherhood became more than a northern creation. They were a vessel carrying the world's darkest arts back to the north, blending them with their own traditions until no one could say where one influence ended and another began. They were hunters of men, forged in many forges, some of snow and pine, others of silk and marble. And as their methods grew more refined, so too did their reach. A blade trained in the fjords might carry the lessons of the steppe into the courts of Denmark. Another, schooled in the alleys of Constantinople, might walk the forests of Sweden with foreign tricks hidden in his hands. The Brotherhood's network stretched with the Viking world itself, carried on the prows of ships to every shore they touched. The shadow that moved in the north was no longer purely Norse. It was a shadow stitched together from every place the sea rovers had gone. And in that weaving of foreign skill and northern purpose, the assassins of the Viking Age became something truly formidable. Not every killing in the Brotherhood's history was done for silver, politics, or clan vengeance. Some deaths were offerings. In a world where the gods walked unseen, and fate was woven by the Norns themselves, there were times when the blade was guided, not by human order, but by divine will. These were the sacred murders, the ritual killings carried out as acts of worship, appeasement, or prophecy. In the old faith of the North, the line between religion and life was thin. Battles were fought under the gaze of Odin, harvests blessed by Freya, and voyages prayed over by Njord. Death itself was not an ending but a crossing, and the means of that crossing mattered. To die in battle was glorious. To die in sacrifice was powerful. To kill in sacrifice was to act as the hand of the gods. The Brotherhood understood this deeply. They were already bound to Odin in oath and symbol, and in certain moments, the killing of a chosen man became more than an assassination. It became a sacred rite. Some of these deaths were ordered by jarls who wished to honour the gods before a campaign, believing that a human life given to Odin would bring victory. Others were decreed by the Brotherhood's own seers, men who claimed to read omens in the flight of ravens, the casting of runes, or the dreams sent by the Allfather. The chosen victims in such rituals were not always enemies. Sometimes they were captives taken in raids, their fate decided from the moment they were bound. Other times they were traitors or oath-breakers from within the clan, whose deaths could both cleanse the community and please the gods. In rare cases, the god's will was said to fall upon a man of high rank, a jarl or even a king, whose removal would shift the course of fate itself. The methods of sacred murder were steeped in symbolism. Hanging was sacred to Odin, echoing his own sacrifice upon Yggdrasil. Victims might be strung from the branches of a sacred tree, their bodies swaying in the wind, as offerings to the god of wisdom and death. Sometimes the hanging was combined with stabbing or cutting, the spilling of blood completing the gift. Another method was the spear. Odin's own weapon was Gungnir, and to kill with the thrust of a spear was to dedicate the act directly to him. In such killings, the assassin might whisper a prayer as he struck, sending the victim's soul swiftly to the one-eyed god. Some Brotherhoods even marked the spear with runes before the deed, making it both weapon and talisman. Blood sacrifice played its role as well. The killing would be timed to coincide with Blot's sacrificial feasts held at solstices, equinoxes, or before major undertakings. The victim's blood might be collected in bowls, sprinkled upon sacred stones, or poured over carvings of the gods. To outsiders, it might look like pagan savagery. To the Brotherhood, it was the completion of a bargain with the divine. The site of the killing mattered. Sacred murders were not carried out in alleys or in the hidden corners of longhouses. They were done at places of power groves, springs, hills crowned with ancient stones. These places were thought to be closer to the gods, the boundaries between worlds thinner. Here, the assassin did not hide his work. Here, the death was meant to be seen by the gods themselves. Some of these ritual killings were meant to seal oaths. Before embarking on a dangerous venture, the Brotherhood might swear by the blood of a victim that they would not rest until the task was complete. This blood oath was binding in the most literal sense. Failure to fulfill it was believed to bring ruin, madness, or death upon those who had sworn. There are fragments in the sagas that hint at such killings. A chieftain disappears before a voyage. A prisoner is given to the gods on the eve of battle. A rival is found hanged in a sacred grove. These stories are told without detail, as though the skalds feared to say too much. The audience, steeped in the same beliefs, would have understood without explanation. To the Brotherhood, such killings were not simply acts of faith, they were acts of power. They bound the killer more tightly to the god he served, reinforcing the oath that gave the Brotherhood its authority. They also sent a message to those who knew of the act. The Brotherhood did not kill only for men, they killed for the gods themselves. The blending of religion and assassination also allowed the Brotherhood to cloak certain political killings in divine purpose. If a powerful man was removed in a way that resembled a sacred murder, it was easier to claim the gods had demanded it. Who would challenge the will of Odin? In this way, faith became both shield and weapon. Even as the North slowly turned toward Christianity, these rites did not vanish entirely. In the early years of conversion, old gods and new walked side by side. Some killings were dressed in the language of Christian justice, while still following the forms of pagan sacrifice. A man might be executed for treason in the eyes of the king, but hanged in a sacred grove in the eyes of the Brotherhood. Over time, the sacred murders became rarer, their meanings lost or deliberately hidden, yet the memory lingered in whispers. In the far reaches of the north, elders spoke of the days when a man might vanish into the woods, only for his body to be found beneath the boughs of the god's own tree. The ravens would circle above, and the wise would nod, knowing that the old ways had been honoured again. For the Brotherhood, these acts remained the most solemn of their craft. To kill for silver was work, to kill for clan was duty, but to kill for the gods was destiny. In those moments, they were not merely blades in the night, they were the hands of the divine, carrying out the fate the Norns had spun. And in the quiet after such a killing, as the wind moved through the trees and the blood steamed in the cold air, the assassin knew he had not acted alone. The gods had walked with him, unseen but near, guiding his hand and claiming the soul he had set free. The Brotherhood's greatest weapon was not the blade, the bow, or even the art of disappearing. It was silence. In the world of the unseen blades, silence was more than the absence of speech. It was the fortress that kept the order alive. But every fortress has a cost. From the moment a man swore the oath, his tongue belonged to the Brotherhood. He could speak to outsiders only in half-truths, never naming names, never revealing the paths he had walked or the deeds he had done. Even to his family, his life became a closed book. Wives were told only that their husbands served in matters of the Jarl. Children knew only that their fathers were away for long stretches and came home with eyes that had seen too much. This secrecy was necessary. The Brotherhood thrived because no one could say for certain who its members were or how they operated. The fear that anyone, friend, servant, fellow warrior, might be a blade in the Brotherhood's service was as powerful as the killings themselves. But for the men who bore that silence, it was a chain that never loosened. The isolation began slowly. At first, a man might join his friends in the longhouse after a voyage, drink, and laugh with the others. But over time, he spoke less, smiled less. Too many of their questions skirted too close to forbidden truths. Too many stories risked revealing more than they should. Eventually, he learned to listen without answering, to watch without joining in. Some found the silence easy. They were men of few words to begin with, hunters and scouts used to long stretches of solitude. But for others, it gnawed at them. They had to carry memories of killings they could not speak of, debts they had paid in blood that no one would ever thank them for. Glory belonged to the warriors who fought in the open. The Brotherhood's victories were buried in the shadows. The penalty for breaking that silence was absolute. Betrayal meant death, not a quick one, but a death meant to serve as a warning. The Brotherhood's enforcers were relentless in hunting down those who had spoken too freely. Some said the worst punishment was not the killing itself, but the erasure that followed. The Brotherhood would destroy all trace of the man's life, burn his possessions, strike his name from carvings, forbid his kin from speaking of him. It was as if he had never existed. This price of silence extended beyond words. Members learned to erase their movements, to leave no trace of where they had been. They never returned to the same hiding place twice. They avoided habits that could be recognized by an enemy's eyes. Even in sleep, they lay in positions that allowed them to rise silently and kill if needed. There was also the burden of secrets kept within the Brotherhood. A man might know who had ordered a killing, who had been spared when they could have been struck down, who had betrayed an ally to achieve a goal. These were dangerous truths, for even within the Brotherhood, alliances could shift. To speak such truths aloud was to invite not only death but chaos within the order. So the silence became heavier with each passing year, weighted with the knowledge of what had been done in the name of the oath. The strain showed in other ways. Some members turned to the gods for strength, offering sacrifices to Odin or Tyr to help them carry the burden. Others drowned it in mead, numbing themselves until the memories blurred. A few simply walked away, not breaking their oath with words, but disappearing into the farthest reaches of the north to live as hermits, far from anyone who might draw them back into the shadows. There were rare moments when the silence broke not in confession, but in the company of brothers who had walked the same path. Around a fire in some hidden camp, they might share a look, a nod, a half-spoken phrase that told of a shared deed without naming it. In these moments, they could remember together without fear of betrayal. But such moments were fleeting. By dawn, each man returned to his own silence, carrying his share of the Brotherhood's unseen history. For those who endured it, the silence became more than a burden. It became part of their identity. They moved differently, spoke less, measured every word. In time, they came to see the world through the eyes of the watcher, the listener. The silence made them more dangerous, for it trained them to notice what others did not. The shift in a man's voice, the glance exchanged across a hall, the footsteps behind them on a dark road. But the cost was high. Many died without their deeds ever being known, their courage unmarked, their skill unpraised. Their families might remember them as distant, strange men who came and went like shadows, never realizing the service they had given or the lives they had shaped. The sagas did not sing of them. The skalds had no verses for the man who killed in silence and left no trace. And yet, within the Brotherhood, there was a different kind of immortality. Those who had walked in silence and kept their oath were remembered not in public songs, but in the whispered names spoken in the dark corners of the longhouse. They lived on in the training of new blades, in the methods passed from hand to hand, in the oaths sworn over blades in the night. The price of silence was the loss of a public name. The reward of silence was the endurance of the Brotherhood itself. For the unseen blades, it was a price worth paying. In the shadows where the Brotherhood walked, trust was the only light. Every blade relied on it, trusted that his brothers would keep the oath, trusted that no one would turn his name over to an enemy, trusted that the man beside him in the dark would not become the hand that struck him down. But in the long history of the unseen blades, there were moments when that trust broke. And when it did, the Brotherhood answered with a fury that could shake kingdoms. Betrayal came in many forms. Some were simple and mercenary, a man taking silver from an enemy to reveal the Brotherhood's secrets. Others were tangled in love or blood, an assassin sparing a target because of family ties, or warning a victim because of some unspoken debt. And then there were the deepest betrayals, those who took the Brotherhood's skills and used them for their own purposes, without the sanction of the oath. The punishment for such acts was absolute. No exile, no forgiveness. Once a man was marked as traitor, the Brotherhood would hunt him until he was dead. It did not matter if he fled across the sea or vanished into the far north, he carried with him the stain of broken oath, and the Brotherhood could not let that stain spread. The hunt for a traitor was different from any other mission. It was personal. The killers sent after him were not only avenging the Brotherhood's honour, they were cleansing themselves of the shame of having once called him brother. These hunts were relentless. The traitor would find no safe harbour, no sympathetic ear. Those who might shelter him were reminded, often violently, that his fate was sealed. Some of the Brotherhood's most feared killings came from these hunts. There are whispered tales of men found days after they vanished, their bodies arranged as a warning, a broken blade in their hands, the mark of the raven carved into their flesh. Others simply disappeared, swallowed by the land or the sea, their end never spoken of but always understood. Blood debts were another matter. A blood debt was owed when a brother's life was taken, whether by enemy hand or by treachery within. Such debts could last years, even decades. A man might grow old knowing that somewhere another was bound by oath to spill his killer's blood, and the Brotherhood never forgot. These debts extended to kin. If a brother was murdered and his killer died before the debt could be claimed, the duty sometimes fell upon the killer's sons or brothers. This was not vengeance for its own sake, it was the fulfillment of a bond that had been broken. To the Brotherhood, a blood debt unpaid was a wound in the order's body, one that would fester until it was healed in blood. There were times when betrayal and blood debt tangled together. A man might betray the Brotherhood, and in doing so cause the death of a fellow blade. In such cases, his fate was doubly sealed. Not only would the Brotherhood hunt him for the betrayal, but the kin and sworn brothers of the slain would take up the debt as their own. These hunts were merciless, often ending with the traitor brought down in ways meant to echo the death he had caused. One of the most chilling tales among the old assassins is of a man named Skadi the Silent. Skadi was said to be one of the finest blades of his generation, a master of infiltration who could walk through an enemy's hall as though he belonged there. But greed undid him. He took silver from a rival Jarl to spare a target chosen by the Brotherhood, and in doing so, allowed the man to live. Weeks later, that spared man struck down a young brother during a raid. The Brotherhood's response was swift. Skadi vanished from his home in the middle of the night. His body was found days later, hanging from the mast of his own ship, a broken sea axe tied around his neck. Those who saw it understood the message. The Brotherhood does not forgive, and it does not forget. In some cases, a man might not even realise he had incurred a blood debt until the killers came for him. A careless act, a drunken brawl, a reckless raid might lead to the death of a brother, and the survivors would judge whether the killing had been justified. If they decided it had not, the debt was marked. From that moment on, the man walked with a shadow at his back. Blood debts could also be political tools. A powerful Jarl might shelter a man marked for death, hoping to turn the Brotherhood's wrath into leverage. Such games were dangerous. There are stories of Jarls whose halls were set ablaze, of entire households slaughtered, simply because they thought they could stand between the Brotherhood and its justice. The enforcement of these debts and punishments served a greater purpose than revenge. It kept the Brotherhood whole. In a world built on secrecy and trust, even one unpunished betrayal could unravel everything. By making their vengeance absolute and inevitable, the Brotherhood sent a clear message to friend and foe alike. The oath was not a suggestion. It was life itself. For those within the Order, these stories were both warning and reassurance. They knew that if they stayed true, the Brotherhood would protect them with the same ferocity it destroyed traitors. And they knew that if they strayed, no corner of the world would keep them safe. In the end, betrayals and blood debts were rare, for the cost was so high. But their rarity made them all the more feared. When the Raven's shadow fell across a man's door, and the whisper came that the Brotherhood had marked him, he knew that his days were counted in single digits. For the unseen blades, loyalty was not just a virtue, it was survival. And for those who broke it, the price was always paid in blood. The Viking Age is remembered for its open wars, armies clashing on the field, fleets locking oars in the spray of battle. But beneath these thunderous confrontations ran another kind of war, one fought in silence and darkness, where no skald sang of victories and no carvings marked the dead. These were the shadow wars, the unseen struggles between rival brotherhoods, factions of killers, and the hidden blades of competing Jarls. The Brotherhood was not the only hand in the north, skilled at killing unseen. Across the fjords, islands, and trade routes, other secret orders took root, each with its own methods, loyalties, and codes. Some were small, serving a single Jarl or clan. Others were wide-reaching networks, stretching from the Baltic to the Western Isles. Most avoided open conflict with one another. Killing in the shadows was dangerous enough without making enemies of those who walked the same path. But when lines were crossed, when a killing disrupted another's work, or when rival clients sought the same target, war in the shadows could erupt. These conflicts rarely began with open strikes. At first, there were warnings. A dead raven left on a threshold, a mark carved into a doorframe, a message whispered by a stranger in the market. Such signs told a Brotherhood that another hand had entered its territory. If the message was ignored, the next step was usually blood. The first blows in a shadow war were often surgical, removing key members of the rival order, quietly, without leaving proof of who had done it. A missing courier here, a vanished informant there. These killings disrupted the enemy's flow of information and sowed fear in their ranks. Both sides tried to avoid large-scale massacres. Too much blood too quickly would draw the attention of Jarls, kings, or the Thing, and neither side wanted the open world to know how deep their knives ran. Sometimes, the war played out in a game of possession and theft. A Brotherhood might intercept a rival's payment or steal a contract outright, completing the killing before the other could act. This was not only a loss of silver, it was a humiliation, a public reminder that the rival could not protect its own work. In such cases, the offended Brotherhood almost always answered in kind. There were also battles for territory, not in the open sense, but in the quiet control of certain ports, markets, or stretches of road. The Brotherhoods watched these places closely, for they were the arteries through which contracts flowed. To control a market was to control the flow of information. To control a harbour was to decide which ships and which killers could pass without trouble. These shadow wars were not always fought blade to blade. Some were waged with rumour and falsehood, each side working to poison the other's reputation with clients. A whispered word that a rival had broken an oath or failed a mission could be as deadly as a dagger in the ribs. Such lies, if believed, could dry up the flow of contracts and leave the rival starving for work. When the wars did turn violent, they were short, sharp, and devastating. Ambushes at night, infiltrations of rival safe houses, and sudden coordinated strikes on known meeting places could wipe out entire cells of assassins in a single night. These were not duels, they were exterminations. The victors did not want survivors who might rebuild the rival order. One of the most infamous shadow wars is remembered in whispers as the Raven Feud. Two major brotherhoods, both claiming Odin's blessing, clashed over the control of trade routes between Norway and the Western Isles. At first, it was a Cold War, contracts stolen, informants murdered, but it escalated when a high-ranking blade of one order was found, nailed to the door of a hall in Orkney, his eyes pecked out by ravens. The message was clear: one of you will not survive this. What followed was a year of silent killings and disappearances that left both orders bleeding. Ships burned in harbour, masters were cut down in their own beds. By the end, neither side had truly won. Both had been weakened so badly that smaller brotherhoods and lone killers moved in to take their contracts. The Raven Feud became a lesson in the Brotherhood's history. Never let pride draw you into a shadow war you cannot finish. But even with such lessons, these wars could not be avoided entirely. The very nature of the work meant that lines would be crossed, marks would be contested, and pride would flare. And when it did, the war was inevitable. Shadow wars were also fought within the same order. Factions might form around powerful masters, each vying for influence over contracts, training, or the loyalty of keyblades. These internal wars were even more dangerous than battles with rivals. The combatants knew each other's hiding places, disguises, and habits. Some orders were torn apart entirely by such struggles, their surviving members scattering to join other brotherhoods or work as lone blades. To the outside world, these conflicts were invisible. Merchants might notice a sudden rise in unsolved killings, or jarls might hear that certain dangerous men had vanished. But they rarely understood that these were not random acts of violence. They were moves in a game of survival and dominance, played far beneath the surface. The Brotherhoods knew the truth. The shadow world was as treacherous as the seas, and only those who could weather both the storms without and the storms within could endure. For all their secrecy and discipline, they were still human, driven by loyalty, greed, vengeance, and pride. And when those forces collided, the shadows themselves seemed to run red. In the end, the shadow wars left no monuments. No cairns marked the graves of the fallen. Their victories were not celebrated, their defeats not mourned in public. The only record of them lay in the altered balance of power, who controlled which routes, which halls, which whispers in the night. For the unseen blades, survival in these wars was the ultimate test. A killer who could outlast such a storm was more than just skilled. He was forged in the purest fire of the Brotherhood's world. And those who perished were forgotten by the outside world, but remembered in the only way that mattered, as a warning. By the final decades of the Viking Age, the shadow world of the Brotherhood was changing. The longships still sailed, but their destinations were shifting from the wild coasts of raiding to the bustling harbours of trade. The feasts of victory were fewer, the wars more calculated. Christianity was spreading, and with it came new laws, new courts, and new ways of wielding power. For the unseen blades, these were the years of the last contracts, the final acts of a brotherhood born in an age of gods and blood oaths. The rise of Christian kings was perhaps the greatest change. These rulers sought to unify their realms under law and cross, pushing aside the old clan loyalties that had fed the Brotherhood's work. Feuds were discouraged, trials replaced duels, and vengeance killings were framed as crimes rather than honourable duties. The Brotherhood could still work in the cracks of this new order, but the cracks were closing. Some of the last great contracts were tied to this shift. Jarls who resisted conversion or clung to the old ways often found themselves targeted not only by Christian kings, but sometimes by their own kin, eager to curry favour with the new order. The Brotherhood took these contracts reluctantly. Killing a man for politics was one thing, but killing one of their own faith at the behest of the White Christ's servants cut against their oath to Odin. Yet silver still shone, and survival required adaptation. The contracts of this era were more delicate than the blood feuds of the past. The Brotherhood was hired to remove troublesome chieftains before they could rally pagan resistance, to silence skalds whose verses mocked Christian kings, to end the lives of rebel leaders before their armies could form. These were political killings dressed in the garb of law and piety, and the Brotherhood became the hidden blade behind the Christian consolidation of power. At the same time, the old work had not vanished entirely. Some clans still called on the Brotherhood to avenge insults and killings, especially in the northern reaches, where the priest's words carried less weight. These contracts were dangerous not because of the targets, but because of the attention they drew. A feud spilling into violence could now draw the intervention of a king's court, and with it a trial that might drag the Brotherhood's name into the light. The Brotherhood adapted by becoming quieter still. Where once they might leave a symbolic mark on the body or a token at the scene, now they left nothing at all. The killing had to look like an accident, an illness, a simple misfortune. A man might drown while fishing in calm waters, fall from his horse on a clear road, or choke on a bone at a feast. The blade's work was hidden so deeply that even those who had ordered it could not always be certain it had been done by the Brotherhood's hand. There were contracts of a different nature, too, tidying the affairs of the old gods. Some of the last great pagan leaders feared that their deaths would leave their shrines vulnerable, their sacred sites unprotected. They hired the Brotherhood not to kill their enemies, but to kill those who would defile their holy places once they were gone. These were not acts of vengeance, but of guardianship, a grim stewardship of a dying faith. By the 11th century, the Brotherhood's world was shrinking fast. Trade and diplomacy were replacing the endless raids that had once created so many opportunities for shadow work. The Christian kings began to build their own networks of spies and agents, men who answered not to an oath-bound Brotherhood, but directly to the crown. These new servants were dangerous in their own way, backed by the resources of a kingdom and protected by law. They were not as skilled as the Brotherhood's killers, but they did not need to be. The law itself shielded them. The Brotherhood's last contracts often carried a note of finality. Older blades spoke of them as closing the accounts of the old age. A final blood debt settled, a last rival removed. A dangerous witness silenced before the Christian courts could use him to dismantle the order. Each contract felt like a step further into the shadows. Not the comfortable darkness the Brotherhood had always moved in, but a narrowing tunnel leading toward an end they could no longer avoid. Some blades refused these final contracts altogether. They laid down their weapons, retreating into obscurity. A few vanished into the far north, into the Sami lands where the White Christ's reach was weakest. Others took service with foreign lords, carrying their skills to Rus, to Byzantium, even to the caliphates, where shadow work still had a place in politics. But for those who stayed, the work went on, though it grew rarer each year. The last known great killing, attributed to the Brotherhood in the sagas, was the death of a Norwegian noble named Hallvarder the Pious. Hallvarder was a staunch Christian and a favourite of the king, tasked with hunting down pagan holdouts in the north. He was found dead one winter morning, frozen in the snow outside his own hall, no wound upon him. The skalds whispered that he had been taken by the Old One, but those who knew the Brotherhood's ways believed a sea axe had touched his throat and let the cold finish what the blade began. After that, the Brotherhood's name fades from the record. The contracts stopped, or else were taken by others who had learned from them. The skills they had honed for generations scattered into other hands, thieves, mercenaries, royal spies. The oath-bound order that had once terrified jarls and kings was becoming a memory. Yet in the far corners of the north, whispers remained. A man gone missing in the night. A death too clean to be chance. A shadow moving where no one should be. These were not proof, only echoes. But for those who remembered the Brotherhood, they were enough. The last contracts were not simply the end of a career, they were the end of an age. The age of oaths sworn in blood, of vengeance as sacred duty, of blades in the night bound to gods older than the cross. And as the last blades vanished into the dark, they carried with them not just their skills, but the silence that had always been their truest weapon. When the Viking Age ended, the longships still cut across the seas, but the world they had once carried was fading. The Brotherhood of the Unseen Blades was no longer the shadow arm of jarls and kings. Yet their name, their deeds and their methods refused to vanish entirely. They sank beneath the surface of history, becoming something else, part memory, part warning, part legend. The sagas, those great woven tales of the north, rarely named the Brotherhood outright. To do so would have been dangerous even in their prime. and impossible once they had faded from public life. But the stories remembered them in different forms. The nameless men in the night, who carried out a killing that shifted the fate of a clan, the wolf in man's shape, who struck without warning. The raven's shadow that fell upon the door of the doomed. These were the skald's ways of speaking of the Brotherhood without speaking their name. As the centuries passed, the details blurred. The assassins became ghosts in the popular imagination, spirits sent by Odin to punish oathbreakers, or cursed men condemned to wander the earth until they paid some ancient blood debt. In the Christian era, some of these tales were recast as demons or the servants of the devil, their killings viewed not as acts of skill, but as supernatural interventions. Still, the old signs lingered. In certain villages, to find a dead raven left on your threshold was considered an omen that you had enemies near. In the far north, where the priest's influence came late, the saying persisted, "When the snow hides the wolf's paw, watch your step." Among those who knew, it meant that danger walked unseen, just as the Brotherhood had once done. The Brotherhood's methods outlived their name. Royal courts and noble households began to use agents trained in stealth, deception, and silent killing. Some of these were men who had once been blades themselves, others apprentices taught by those who had fled the Brotherhood's collapse. Even the Christian kings, who had once hunted them, found value in their skills so long as they served the crown rather than the old gods. Whispers of the Brotherhood's legacy appear in records from foreign lands as well. In the courts of Novgorod and Kiev, Norsemen served as bodyguards and agents, using tactics that bore the hallmarks of the unseen blades. In the east, the Byzantines recorded the presence of northern silent men in their service, skilled at slipping into enemy-held cities under false identities. Even in the distant caliphates, traders spoke of Norsemen who could pass as locals, their accents hidden, their knives quick and clean. Yet while their skills endured, the code of the Brotherhood, the oath-bound loyalty, the binding of blade to purpose, was harder to preserve. Without the rituals, the sacred killings, and the shared faith in Odin, their craft became just another tool in the hands of whoever could pay. Over time, the Brotherhood's art was diluted, scattered among mercenaries, thieves, and royal spies. What had once been a calling became merely a profession. The legends, however, took on a life of their own. In the sagas told around winter fires, the unseen blades became larger than life, part warrior, part spirit, part trickster. They could walk invisible through the streets of a guarded city. They could strike down a king in his own hall and vanish before the cupbearer turned his head. In these tales, their loyalty was to fate itself, not to any lord or coin. Children in the north grew up hearing warnings in the form of these stories. Disrespect your elders, and the raven's shadow will fall upon your door. Break an oath, and the wolf in man's shape will come for you in the night. These were moral tales wrapped in fear, using the Brotherhood's memory to keep old values alive. Even in the age of printed chronicles, fragments of their existence continue to surface. A 14th century Icelandic manuscript mentions a guild of silent men who carried out a killing in the service of a powerful bishop. Danish legal records from the 15th century describe the execution of a man accused of walking with the wolves and carving the raven's mark, phrases scholars now believe to be echoes of the old assassin Brotherhood. In the modern age, historians argue over how much of the legend is truth. Some claim the Brotherhood was no more than a loose collection of hired killers, their mystique exaggerated over centuries. Others see them as an organised force, an elite order that shaped politics as much as any army or fleet. The truth, as with all things in the shadows, may lie somewhere between, but in the north, there are still places where the old ways have long memories. Hunters who move silently through the forests speak of using the Brotherhood steps. Fishermen who disappear into fog-drenched inlets speak of walking the raven's path. And in the high valleys where few go, some claim to see lone figures watching from the rocks, wrapped in dark cloaks, their faces hidden too far away to greet, too steady to be wanderers. Perhaps these are nothing more than echoes, or perhaps, in some hidden fjord or deep forest, a remnant of the Brotherhood still survives, their oath unbroken, their knives kept sharp. If so, they would not speak of it. They never did. The legacy of the unseen blades is not carved in stone or written in law. It is carried in whispers, in the way a man checks over his shoulder, in a silent street, in the superstition that lingers when a raven lands on your roof. It is in the knowledge, half remembered and never proven, that somewhere Someone may be watching, just as they always have. The Brotherhood may have faded, but their shadow is long, and in the quiet places of the north, where snow falls without a sound, and the trees lean close together, that shadow still moves. History has a way of swallowing its shadows. Armies are remembered in carvings and sagas, kings in gilded chronicles, battles in the names of hills and rivers. But the men who walked unseen, who shaped the fate of the north without ever raising a banner, are left to fade into the spaces between the words. So it was with the Brotherhood of the Unseen Blades. Their time came, and their time passed. Yet they did not vanish in the way other orders do. They did what they had always done. They slipped quietly into the dark and were gone. By the dawn of the High Middle Ages, the world they had been made for no longer existed. The old gods were whispered about in secret. The Thing assemblies were increasingly bound by the will of kings, and the endless clan feuds that had once fed the Brotherhood's work were dying out under the iron weight of royal law. Where once the shadow had been a weapon in every chieftain's hand, now it was a liability. Some say the Brotherhood chose their own end, that the masters gathered one last time, somewhere in the high valleys or deep fjords, and agreed that their purpose had been fulfilled. They had preserved their oaths for generations, taken lives for clan, for coin, for gods, and for reasons they would never speak aloud. But they knew the age of such work was closing. Better to disappear by their own choice than to be hunted down one by one. Others believed the Brotherhood never truly ended, that it transformed. Some blades became the personal agents of kings, serving in new courts where the oaths were written in parchment rather than carved in blood. Some became mercenaries in foreign lands, taking their craft to places where the old kind of shadow work was still in demand. Others may have slipped into the quiet life of farmers, fishermen, or traders, their knives buried deep but never quite forgotten. And then there are those who whisper that the Brotherhood still walks among us, that their oaths were never broken, only passed in secret from master to apprentice, that even now, in the cold Northlands, there are men and women who know the steps that leave no tracks, who can move without disturbing the snow, who can strike in silence and vanish, as though the wind itself had carried them away. We will never know for certain. That was the Brotherhood's way to be unknown, unseen, unproven. To the end, their truest weapon was not their blade, nor their skill, nor even their loyalty. It was their silence. Yet their presence lingers, not in names or records, but in the instincts of those who live in the north, in the way hunters pause before stepping onto fresh snow, in the way villagers watch the tree line when the dogs grow restless, in the way a sudden knock at the door after dark still makes the heart quicken. These are old memories, passed not through history but through something deeper, an inherited sense that in this land, shadows have always had eyes. In the quiet places, the signs still appear. A raven feather left on a doorstep, boot prints that stop halfway across a field, a door that was closed at dusk but stands slightly ajar at dawn. Perhaps these are nothing, or perhaps they are reminders that the Brotherhood's oath still binds someone somewhere. For all their secrecy, for all the lives they took without leaving their names, the unseen blades left a legacy that no skald could erase. They were not heroes in the way the sagas define heroism, but they were craftsmen of survival, of vengeance, of unseen war. They shaped the fate of clans, altered the course of kingships, and upheld the old ways long after they should have been forgotten. And so their story ends as it was always meant to, not with a final battle or a last great killing, but with a disappearance. One day they were there, moving through the night, taking contracts whispered in shadow, and the next they were gone. No graves, no farewell feasts, no songs to carry their names, only the faintest echo of footsteps in the frost, fading into the black line of the forest. Perhaps they are truly gone, or perhaps they are waiting for a time when the world will again need the kind of work that only they can do. Waiting for the return of the old ways, for the gods to rise from silence, for the clans to take up their feuds anew. Waiting for the first oath to be sworn again in blood and shadow. Until that day, the Brotherhood remains where they have always been, in the space between fear and certainty, in the stories told when the fire burns low, in the cold breath of the north wind that makes you turn your head, though no one is there. They are the shadows, they are the silence, and they will be forever.